Hello, welcome to the Meta Ads Strategy for 2025 Masterclass. Today I'm going to walk you through all of the new changes in Meta, some of the best practices, some principles, go through a bunch of free tools if you stay till the end, and a lot more. So let's go ahead and jump in. And I'll start off right away with the flow chart here, which breaks down our campaign structure so we can just hit the ground running. All right, so here is the overall campaign structure from what we have seen work best for the majority of brands. And keep in mind, we spend millions and millions of dollars a year on Meta, as well as Google, primarily for premium luxury brands. So that's really our area of expertise. Now, universal campaign settings, just high level, what do these universal settings look like? First of all, 7-day click attribution for 2025. All right. I know a lot of people are still on 7-day click, 1-day view. It's not a really bad thing, but technically the closer you get to 1-day click attribution, the more incremental, meaning the closer you get to that, the more likely that revenue number you see in your ads dashboard matches that revenue number you see in your Shopify dashboard or WooCommerce dashboard. Okay. 7-day is a good time frame because you do allow a little bit of time for some decision fatigue. Now, of course, if you are a high AOV brand, it's not a bad thing to consider a 28-day click if you're selling products at 5 or 10K plus in order value, or if you're a more of a consumable or very low AOV product, again, going down to 1-day click is not a bad idea either. But always keep in mind that the closer you get to 1-day click, the more incremental that revenue number will be. But 7-day, I think for most brands is very reasonable. Now, customer list exclusions. Our overall ad strategy is really focused on excluding customers from our campaigns. And we really want to separate things into new customer campaigns and returning customer campaigns. We really don't want any overlap here. So what that means is if you have a new customer campaign, we need to make sure we upload a CSV. We need to make sure we're excluding purchase conversion events. And if you do have first party data and custom conversion events, also excluding any purchasing events from that as well. And that's just a standard. And for ASC campaigns, just putting that existing customer inclusion at 0%. Now for targeting in general, it's going to be broad. We are way past the days of targeted audiences now. With that said, do they work? Yeah, they do work, but they don't really work that much better than broad. Sometimes if you have an extremely niche product, you can go ahead and put in a little interest stack, but I see it outperform extremely rarely. Now, what does broad mean? That means you can adjust things based on country or general location, right? Gender, and then age. Those are really your big, broad targeting changes. But if you do have any of these changed, I recommend separating that out into a separate campaign. So if you have a US and a UK campaign, that's perfect. That's what you should have for broad. If you're a clothing brand and you have a lot of women's and a lot of men's, that stuff should go in different campaigns. And if you have to distill that down again into countries, do that as well. So you could have a UK men's, UK women's, et cetera, et cetera. That's kind of the overall structure. All right. Again, 180-day purchase exclusions for all of our top of funnel campaigns. And we'll talk about lower funnel activities here in a minute. So we really separate brands into two categories: aesthetic-based brands and utility brands. And there is, of course, some gray area. There's overlap here for sure, but typically you're going to fall into one of these categories. Again, aesthetic-based brands are going to be the brands that are selling clothes, jewelry, art, home decor, anything in that kind of realm. Utility-based brands, supplements is probably the biggest. You have automotive stuff, office gear, some apparel will definitely fall into utility, that kind of thing, right? So the way you structure these two kinds of brands is a little bit different. The thing that makes someone buy from an aesthetic-based brand is typically just overall the design. They like how that piece looks. They think it looks nice. It's very much, I see it, I like it. There's not a lot of logical decision-making going on. Most of the decision is emotional and made up on the fact that they just like the thing they see. So because a lot of the decision hangs on to that one fact, the priority for those types of brands needs to be testing as many product varieties and variants as possible. So imagine if you're selling t-shirts, you want to show it to people as many t-shirt designs as possible. That's how you're going to get someone to buy. It doesn't really matter as much what the format is, if it's a video or an image or someone inside or outside with the t-shirt. It's like they either like the t-shirt or they don't. It's not complicated. Apparel is one of the easiest niches to advertise for because it's literally they like the piece or they don't. Nothing I can say will probably make them like it more other than maybe calling out a certain material or manufacturing process or mission-based brand association with an influencer. But most of it's they either like it or they don't, okay? Utility brand is kind of the opposite, right? Most of the decision factor, while it very much is emotional, is based on some sort of benefit or life-changing impact that this thing will provide. If it's a supplement, that's whatever the benefits or health impacts that supplement will provide. So it's very much a problem solution focused sales argument that needs to happen with these types of brands. So you need to show what the problem is, provide your solution, explain how the solution works, and then show that it works with proof. So that looks like social proof, reviews, PR, that kind of thing. So if it's a supplement, that would be saying this supplement, you have low energy. That's the problem. Our supplement fixes low energy. It does it with these 5 ingredients. We've spent a long time manufacturing it in the USA or whatever, and here's a lot of people that have had success with it. And it's testing as many of these problem solution angles as possible because different people are trying to solve different problems and different people will believe in different solutions, right? Some people will think that the ingredients really matter. Others will really think that this influencer who mentioned it, that will make it really matter and work for them, right? So you just about testing as many problem solution angles as possible. Those are like kind of the 2 forks in the road, and that is the crux of how you sell for aesthetic-based brands and utility-based brands. Now, of course, there's overlap there, but typically you can kind of narrow down your customer segments or your target market into people that care more about one of those things, even if you do have a lot of gray area, okay? So for both of these, we're going to be running ABO campaigns. The reason for that is we do just want control and direct budget control over the variants that are running and over the problem solution angles that are running. So we're going to have multiple ad sets for aesthetic-based brands, again, testing variants. So that might be campaign 1 is t-shirts, campaign 2 is pants, campaign 3 is shoes. And then within the t-shirt campaign, you have red shirts, blue shirts, green shirts. In this case, it'll probably be different designs or cuts, right? So you can run it that way. Another way is if you don't have a lot of variants, let's say you're like, we only sell one design. We're kind of a limited release type brand that does drops. In that case, you're going to want to test creative formats in your ad sets. So you'd have that one design t-shirt at the campaign level. And then within that, every ad set is just a different creative format, video, high production, low production, however you want to separate it, whatever makes sense for you. That's what that looks like. Now for utility-based brands, it's a little bit different here. So it's always going to be the problem solution angle testing for the most part, where each ad set is a different problem and solution and a different angle at selling your product, potentially hitting a slightly different demographic as well. So that's the overall view. Now, when it comes to creative, videos, photos, what does that look like? First of all, we try to keep most of the AI stuff off, except for some of the comments and small optimization features. Most of them are terrible, and you'll end up with creative with a huge block of random text over it that you didn't want to add. They're using you as the guinea pig when you keep those ASC creative settings on. They're using you for their training data, so just keep that in mind. But we just keep the very basic settings on there. In terms of photo to video, here's a very broad generalization, but something that does help a lot of brands. Again, typically for aesthetic-based brands, 3-to-1 image to video. For utility-based brands, 1-to-3 image to video, right? So for every 3 images, you want 1 video for aesthetic-based brands. Now, this is not a hard and fast rule, but again, we think about this magazine style, something that's scannable. If I can see 5 different designs really quick in a quick scroll of an image or in a catalog or in a DPA style ad where I can just swipe through a bunch of different designs like you would a magazine, you see something you like, you click on it. That's how a lot of transactions happen. The videos help kind of show how the product moves. maybe how it looks in different lighting, different scenes, lifestyle, studio, etc. But a lot of aesthetic-based brands just sell off of kind of that magazine, very scannable format. Utility-based brands, usually there's more explaining that needs to go on, a lot more educating that needs to go on. In that case, video typically does a better job of that. So typically lean a little bit more on the video side for those types of brands. Now that said, I've seen every which way of this in terms of the ratio of video to image, but this is just kind of a guiding principle to get you started. Again, it also depends on the brand's resources. Obviously, it's a lot cheaper and less expensive to test with images, right? I can produce 20 images a lot faster than I can produce 20 videos. So again, if you are lower on budget, definitely worth a consideration on that front. The third consideration here for ad creative formats is the prospecting bias. So typically stories and reels at the moment are given prospecting bias. They typically are the best ads for reaching net new people. That's just how the algorithm is weighted at the moment. So with that, if you do want to really prioritize net new awareness, story, reels, format, and aspect ratios will probably get you to that highest cohort of net new awareness. So worth the consideration there as well. Let's move on to middle of funnel ASC campaigns. Now, ASC you can absolutely run as your kind of main prospecting campaign as well. What we typically do is we do a side-by-side test of ABO prospecting with this format I just explained, alongside a similar structure of an ASC campaign with a 0% existing customer inclusion. And we test those side by side and see if we want to kind of have our ASC as our prospecting engine or if we want to run ABO as our prospecting engine. It really depends on the brand. I've seen it almost 50-50 split where one or the other does perform better over time, and we typically put more budget into that particular campaign. I think it is niche dependent. I think certain niches are better suited for ASC campaign. I think typically aesthetic-based brands where there is a lot of people in market for the product, to me seems like ASC typically is the better prospecting engine. While brands that have less people in market and perhaps it's a more novel product or a newer market or a smaller TAM, those might do a little bit better with ABO, just from what I've seen. That said, test both side by side to figure out which one is your prospecting engine over the course of honestly a month or two to see what performs better over time. Same creatives, same budget, same setup overall, okay? That said, across the board, we almost always use ASC as sort of an evergreen middle of funnel campaign where we put in SKU wide assets, evergreen assets, brand first assets, where instead of just having content that's focused on one SKU at a time or that's just very focused on specific product lines, we have more of that content that's evergreen and can apply to a lot of products like behind the scenes footage of the manufacturing process or a founder interview. Stuff like that would go into the ASC campaign because it naturally very much skews towards more of a buyer ready middle funnel audience, and that kind of middle funnel content complements that very nicely. And again, we still have the same ratio here of image to video based on these, but again, you can totally use these as top of funnel. Just depends on the brand. I've seen it work both ways, right? Now looking at other campaign types, so DSP, obviously not really a campaign type, more of a creative strategy. For aesthetic based brands can really work. Those display product ads, they work great. I would recommend them definitely if you are an aesthetic-based brand to try those out. They are similar to catalogs. They perform fairly similarly to a concentrated manual ABO campaign where you only have a few assets in that campaign. So definitely worth testing those out against just normal single static images for your aesthetic-based brand. Typically would not recommend DSP for utility-based brands. Just don't see it work as often. It can, I just don't see it as often. And for both, I definitely recommend having a separated catalog campaign where all you have in there is that dynamic product feed. Images only, of course, really simple setup, same customer exclusions and all of that. Just give that a little bit of budget as well to kind of catch up some of that slack on the more bottom of funnel. Okay. Now, one thing worth noting is, retargeting and reactivation, right? Retargeting where you're manually telling Meta to go and show ads to people who have either seen an ad or added to cart or shown some kind of interest. And then reactivation where we go in and we try to get existing customers to buy again. I really think these days, unless you are a high AOV brand, meaning 2,500, 3K average first order AOV plus, if that's you, definitely go ahead, set up a, again, ABO campaign, except this time put in your past purchaser, 180-day purchaser inclusion, as well as your purchasing event inclusion from the website data. That definitely would make sense for you if you are looking at doing a reactivation campaign and putting in content and creative that speaks very much and only to those returning customers by calling them out directly. So that definitely is a great strategy. But again, I would really only recommend reactivation or retargeting. Retargeting, the difference being you just put in add to carts or website visits from 180 days instead of the actual purchase. I would really only recommend that strategy for the higher AOV brands. So definitely take that with a grain of salt. Meta does a great job of retargeting already, very much optimizes the number of times someone should see your ad. So this is really just for those high AOV brands that need some of those extra touch points to get the purchase or to realize their lifetime value because their product is just so expensive. All right, that's the broad overview. Now let's get into some more of these details, okay? So the big change that happened here was in December 2024, a little bit ago here. We had Andromeda get released by Meta, which is their new, more AI optimized algorithm. And if you're curious, you can read on their engineering blog all about it and learn about what exactly this is. The ultimate takeaway from this model is that it's switching more over to a neural network, sort of random forest style model. That's going to be a lot more personalized. You see that word show up a lot here. They talk a lot about the model increasing the ability to have highly personalized ad experiences that take into account significantly more variables than previous. And again, this is being very much powered by some NVIDIA chips here. So definitely take a look at that if you're interested in the specs. But the overall synopsis from this is that with this new model, number one, Meta is going to be focusing, of course, very much on ASC moving forward. The ultimate goal of Meta is to pretty much replace manual campaigns with advanced shopping campaign. And the vision is ultimately to just give them a product and a URL and they create the creative, they do the targeting, they do the budget optimization. You just link your credit card and they handle the rest. That's the vision. And that's kind of what they're working towards. And so this is really going to be mostly affecting ASC campaigns and ASC creative. Now, again, the big shift here is this enhanced AI personalization. So what this means is that the ads are going to get way more niche down because the neural network will be able to identify little pieces of the ads that speak to different people in a lot more intricate way, which means now you should be able to have a lot more niche callouts in your ads, a lot more personalization in your ads for very narrow demographics, and those should work a lot better. It should be able to recognize that messaging and show it to the correct person. So what we're going to see is less broad evergreen marketing that speaks to large demographics or pools of people, and more personalized, very niche, very micro style messaging with ads that very much speak to a extremely small skew of the overall TAM. And that's the big change. And again, this will be represented on ASC campaigns as well as the ASC creative. But overall, even if you don't make these changes and kind of take advantage of this with more of that niche messaging, you should still just see better and more personalized ad performance moving forward. And the ads you get served should also follow suit. Now, we already went through the brand strategy framework here, but again, to reiterate, aesthetic-based brands for 2025, if you are an aesthetic-based brand, your main objective should be SKU testing. Expose your customers or your prospects to as many SKUs and varieties as possible. If you are a utility-based brand, the goal is to expose your prospects to as many angles as possible. So just think about how you can optimize that in your ads. And to kind of diving into that a little bit more, again, a big piece from the utility-based brands is just that features matter more than aesthetics. Of course, aesthetics do matter, but it's really going to be that benefit that the product provides that is going to ultimately sell the consumer. Now, we talked about this previously, but again, ABO, one product per campaign. Okay, so every campaign is one SKU. And then again, aesthetic brands can have variant testing or creative format testing, depending on how their merchandising is structured. When it comes to creatives per ad set, we didn't talk about that already, but really you can technically have as many creatives as you want. The main rule of Meta is that every asset needs an efficacious amount of potential spend, just meaning that every creative needs enough potential budget that could be spent on it. And in that way, you get enough testing data if that actually gets spent. And I'll kind of show you how you can calculate how much you need to allocate in budget in order to get that effect. But for a lot of brands, if you're 6 figures, low 7 figures, 4 to 6 creatives per ad set is good, or asset. But again, you can technically put as many as you want in if your budget is high enough. And again, I'll talk about what that looks like here in a second. And again, reiterating, broad targeting only. I think we've been screaming this for 2 years now, but I still do see some very interesting things happening on that front in some accounts. We talked about ASC as middle of funnel, but also the potential to use as a prospecting campaign if it does test and outperform ABO. But again, just reiterating on the fact that just make sure you put that 0 returning customer threshold in there because otherwise it's going to get pretty messy pretty quick with the amount of returning customers you get. We went through the creative ratio as well. Now getting into the budget and learning kind of formula. It's really, really simple here. So again, the learning phase is roughly 30 to 50 conversions. It's not a thing where the second you get through the learning phase, you are somehow going to get way better CPMs and a way better result. You can have very profitable campaigns within the learning phase. It's just a set standard based on sample size to get you some data. It's just at some point you got to draw the line and say, hey, this is a general view of how much sample data we need to get you a decent result. But of course, there's a million other factors that affect that. So with that, you typically need 50 conversions within 7 days. So to figure out your daily budget allocation, just put 50 over 7 times the historical cost per acquisition for that particular SKU, or how much you expect that cost per acquisition to be based off industry standards, which you can find by niche with a quick Google search. So for example, if your CPA is $10, your minimum daily budget should be $71.42. So again, just 50 over 7 times that $10 CPA. Now, this is where the creative piece comes in. When you're testing new creative, allocate an additional 5% of your budget. This adds flexibility, which can lead to better performance. So if we're at 71.42 for our total daily budget, and this is on one creative, that's great. That's efficacious. But if we add in a second creative, we should tack on another 5% to this. So we should take 5% times 71.42, add it back in. That's what we should have. So if we have 2 additional creatives, so for a total of 3 creatives, we'd be adding in 10%, right? That initial 71.42 plus 5% plus 5%, that's 3 creatives worth of budget there, right? And then same thing moving up. And of course, this does not cascade. So we're just taking 5% of 71.42 and just continually adding that up for every sequential creative. So you don't need to add back in the new amount to that total, okay? But this just gives you a little bit more room when you are adding a lot of creatives in, because every time you add a new creative in, Meta has to make a decision whether to invest in the current performing winner or the current high confidence creative. And it has to kind of take an estimated guess and say, should we put a little spend into this new asset and give it a test? What is the risk of this compared to just putting dollars back into the performing asset? And so you do need to account for a little bit of loss there when you add in new creatives to your daily budget. Now, looking at some of these thresholds here, again, high AOV brands really should be doing some manually retargeting with a manual retargeting campaign, putting in those custom events, CSV files, whatever you have there. Typically 180-day for retargeting, 180-day add to carts, 180-day website visitors, and an email file CSV that has non-purchasers but subscribers in it. with add to carters as well. That would be a great stack to use if you are a high AOV brand that is looking to do some retargeting. For reactivation, you're looking at 180-day purchasers. You're looking at a CSV file of purchasers as well to get them back in, okay? And again, I mentioned all that in this in a bit more detail. When it comes to scaling in 2025, 20% daily is really what we'd recommend. So on lowest cost or on cost controls, which we'll go through here in a minute, 20% is kind of the goal. So if you're spending $100 a day and you want to scale, tomorrow spend 120 and just keep going up. Same is true for CPA goals, ROAS goals, cost controls. If you do want to adjust your cost control, typically recommend not going up or down more than 20%. You can, but just keep in mind you're going to have a lot more volatility than really would be preferable. All right. And then creative testing. So how many creatives can you test a week? Again, we talked about kind of what that daily budget looks like and that little 5% rule as well for every additional creative. But again, technically on paper, you can test as many creatives as you want. It's just that it might not get results in your ideal time frame. For example, if you are spending $100 a day and you're trying to sell a $1,000 product, it might take you a few days just to get one sale versus if you were selling a $1 product, right? With that $100 spend. And when you tack creatives on top of that, for every additional creative you spend, your budget is getting spread thinner and thinner. And you also have to account for that product value too. And so by the end of it, you could have creatives that are only getting a few cents each in spend if there is no current winner. And so you can't really test that efficiently. Though if you kept those ads running for a year, I'm sure all these creatives would eventually get enough spend to start doing something. So it's just all about how long you want to wait to get a result, how long you really want that process to take, and obviously the value of your product, and then your daily budget, and ultimately the number of creatives. All those variables have to be aligned for you to really see the results that you want. So just keep that in mind. But typically, even for small brands spending a very little amount, we try to get at least bare minimum 10 new creatives a week, net new creatives. That means every single month we're testing at least net new 40 creatives. It's really important. A big part of this meta update as well is the emphasis on creative load, because ads are getting more personalized. They're getting more niche. That means the more specific the creative, the more effective it's going to be. And so if you can create a lot more of those very specific creatives, you're going to have a higher volume, and then ultimately you should have a better result. So 10 is the new minimum, bare minimum of creative tests a week. Brands spending any sort of efficacious spend are typically in the realm of 30, 50 to 100, but 10 is bare minimum for any budget level, okay? All right. So again, maximizing that niche diversity-based creative, okay? So again, for new customer acquisition optimized creatives, that's going to lean reels and videos, right? Stories as well. Those are the best net new awareness creative mediums at the moment. Again, what we're also saying is that a high diversity of creative is going to be ideal. So high, low production, UGC, non-UGC, brand generated content, also like some PR content is really good, behind the scene content, educational content. You just really want to focus on diversity of content this year. It's going to be huge, and the Andromeda algorithm is absolutely built for this. And this is really what's going to perform. High variability in both the format and the messaging and the angles and the style of creative that you have. That's going to be how you maximize your results. Now, quick touch on AI, and then we'll get into a cost control conversation and a few other details. I'm not going to go super deep into creative today. I just want to touch on it because it is important. These are the top creative generation tools right now that are actually useful, that you can actually really use. Midjourney is fantastic. It's very inexpensive. I think plans start at $10 a month to generate really nice high def images. It's amazing for backgrounds, effects, like if you want an explosion or something surreal, like an ice cube on fire. Whatever kind of vision you have, you can definitely create with Midjourney. Really good for any kind of backgrounds, 3D effect, anything like that, any surreal image that's hyper realistic. Really great for that. Highly recommended for $10 a month. Sora, more expensive at $200, but this is probably one of the better video tools. There's also Runway ML. I don't think it's nearly as good as Sora, but Sora you can definitely create some high quality stock footage with. And again, like some of those surreal effects as well, whether it's a peaceful forest or a mountain scene or a busy city street, you can get some pretty solid stock footage-esque content that again, you could integrate into your ads, but that's probably where it ends for usefulness at the moment. Image.ai, really solid for putting clothes and layering on your product onto people into static images. Definitely useful. Mockups aren't perfect. They need touch-ups after, but you can definitely kind of take a stock image, t-shirt on white, and put it onto a model, and it works pretty well. Arc ads for UGC generation. We uploaded a case study about Arc ads a while ago. I forget what the results were. It was like 300 purchases in like 20 days. I forget what it was. It was quite a bit of revenue though, and it was a pretty decent ROAS. It's like around a 3.2 for that brand. Their target's like 2.5. So Arc ads, really good. UGC AI generation, I think plans start at around 100 a month, but definitely high ROI for getting UGC style content if you have a good script. So would definitely recommend all of these as well. And this year, we're only going to be seeing more and more AI tools get released. So definitely keep your eyes out and just try them out. It's definitely worth getting a little bit ahead of some of this stuff because you should be able to bring your cost of production way, way down. All right, let's talk about measurement framework a little bit and a few other elements here. So first of all, when we're looking at ads, especially in 2025, most metrics are non-causal and useless. Probably 85%, 90%, I would venture to say. 90% of metrics in Ads Manager are pretty much useless as an e-commerce brand. They just are pretty much not related to revenue. And interpreting them is like, it's so relative on 1,000 other factors. It's not even worth it. Take CPM, for example. CPM is a very important metric, but it's extremely relative to a million different things. It's absolutely absurd. So most metrics don't matter. It's a lot of noise in there. Let's talk about one of the ones that do matter. And this is the most fundamental metric there is. It's as meta as you can get on Meta per se, and this is cost per 1,000 people reached. It's not CPM, it's CPMR, and it leads to CPM. When you take impressions times cost per 1,000 people reached, you ultimately get to your CPM, which is cost per 1,000 impressions. Okay, so this is just the raw cost to show your ad to 1,000 people, and you can ultimately derive the cost to show your ad to one person once, which is the kind of base metric for Meta. So this is an important metric to just be aware of in 2025 because it gives you quite a bit of information when you read into it, and you can compare it to other assets within your account. Again, it's not necessarily true that a high or low cost per 1,000 people reached is bad or good, but what it can tell you in contrast to your other ads is whether something is top or middle of funnel or more bottom of funnel. It can tell you in relation to your creative ranking, if the reason it's potentially high relative to an industry standard is due to poor creative, or whether it might just be seasonal. It can give you quite a bit of information. So to give you kind of the three main uses for this metric, number one is, again, funnel position. So if you have a high cost per 1,000 people reached relative to your other ads, and the frequency is also high, so the number of times the average person sees your ad is also high, then it's likely that an ad is more bottom of funnel. Just the messaging in that ad, if you're not doing any special targeting, just the messaging in that ad, for whatever reason, hits more bottom of funnel. That's where Meta is positioning it. So that's one thing to consider, and that's one way to do it. The inverse is true for top of funnel ads as well. The other thing you can look at is if your creative ranking is low, your ad quality is low, your engagement is low, and your CPMR is very high, that's going to show you do just have a poor ad. Again, relative to your other assets, it's going to show that you have a poor ad and you're actually getting an increase in price because the quality of your ad is not conducive to a good Facebook experience, and they're kind of losing user time because of your ad. You're pretty much making the platform less good, so they're going to dock you for it. So that's what you can look at and compare to those rankings and quality rankings if you see a very high CPMR. The other thing is just also looking for seasonal trends. So if you look at CPMR over time, for example, if you take your cost per 1,000 people reached over the course of a whole year, and you take the daily CPMR of your account, again, over a whole year, you will start to see the seasonal fluctuations in the cost of your audience that you're specifically targeting throughout the year. You'll see November and December typically peak for most niches, especially the aesthetic-based brands. And you'll just see kind of where those opportunities are to spend more and get a little bit cheaper audience. So again, gives you an insight into seasonality, can potentially show where some arbitrage opportunities are on that seasonal timeline. Now, watch time. Let's talk about this one. Big one here. Video soft metrics. So metrics on videos that aren't related to revenue, profit, purchases, but that can be indicative of potential future performance. So watch time is actually fairly correlated to revenue and purchases. Typically what we see relative, not necessarily net watch time. So it doesn't matter if it's necessarily watching a whole 1 minute video or a whole 15-second video, but the longer someone watches of a video relative to that video's playtime, just the higher the percent of the video they watch, the higher correlation there is to revenue and purchases typically. So if you are going to pick one metric to judge your video quality by, it's going to be watch time and playing back the video and seeing where people fall off in that journey. So that would be the one metric that is most of the time correlated to some of those hard metrics. Now, hook rate is important, but not nearly as important as watch time. And that's because a lot of people mess it up by putting in very clickbaity, unrelated content as their hook rate, and they have a extremely high 80% hook rate that's completely unrelated to the rest of the content in the video. And so those metrics simply don't line up. But if your hook is very related and calling out the audience you want to attract, saying if you're 20 and you're looking for a nice piece of jewelry, this ad is for you, that would be a better hook rate, even if the metrics are lower, because at least you know you're probably getting the people you want in the door more so than not. So again, hook rate, somewhat indicative of purchase value, but I wouldn't make a lot of calls off of it. If you have a terrible hook rate, then that's you could probably work on it and improve it, but ultimately it's kind of a secondary metric and it's not something I'd really look at too much unless you're really getting into the weeds and trying to optimize. But first, the main goal is watch time. Then I try to get into hook rate a little bit more, but just don't do any kind of clickbait stuff. Okay. New customer MER. So this is the kind of North Star metric for your ads manager. Revenue, purchases, and ROAS attributed within the ads manager itself. Those are kind of like your in-platform key metrics, and they're important. But what we really want to evaluate success on is real dollars. So how we look at this is very simply with new customer revenue over new customer spend. So something I didn't mention before, and that we'll get into a little bit later, is naming conventions and how you should be separating out your campaigns. I did mention it very slightly at the start, but every campaign should either be new customer or returning customer. You do not want any overlap. And the main reason for that is you want to be able to separate the marketing dollars spent on acquisition versus reactivation or retargeting. Really, with new customer revenue, new customer spend, this gives you a great ratio that shows how many dollars you spent to acquire how many dollars in new customer revenue. So you can really get a nice tight metric that's very much indicative of growth. So if you have a 3 new customer MER, that means for every dollar spent on new customers, you got $3 back in new customer revenue, which would be quite good for most brands. Okay. So that is the North Star. The kind of secondary metric that we look at here is returning customer MER. Same kind of thing, just looking at returning customer dollars. And again, returning customers are mostly impacted by email, organic, direct, and just the nature of your product, the DNA of your product per se. So this metric is less correlated, certainly less causal from the ad front. But if you are a very high AOV brand selling sofas on Meta, I guarantee you're going to be a lot more causal here. And in that case, you are going to want to see how many of your returning customer dollars are turning back into more returning customer dollars, right? So an important one to keep in mind here as well. And again, we're looking at not the revenue on the ads manager, but the store level revenue for both of these metrics. So this just gives us a good idea of what our overall profitability looks like beyond looking at in-platform ROAS, spend, and purchases. And ultimately, profit, net profit contribution margin, 90-day contribution margin, net profit, those are like our true North Stars. But in terms of stuff we can kind of allocate to a channel, these are the things we want to really consider. Now, again, we mentioned this earlier, but we want to stop view through attribution for the majority of brands. Again, the closer to 1 day click you get, the more incremental. 7 day for most brands is pretty good. You don't need to worry about it too much. You can, again, do 28 day if you're a very high AOV, long sales cycle brand. That's not unreasonable. Same thing if you are an impulse buy, very inexpensive product, and you see your customer journeys are very short from first touch point to purchase. Do 1 day click. Yeah, just pick one. But 7 day click for the majority of brands, very good. That's pretty much all you need. All right, high AOV attribution. Again, we mentioned this. If you do have a more expensive product, don't be afraid to extend that attribution out a little bit. Just look at, hey, what is our average sales cycle length? How long from first touch point to purchase does it take? And that should kind of be a good tell into whether you should have a longer or shorter attribution window for your ad platform. All right, now we get into kind of the big stuff here. So 2025, you're going to see a lot more incrementality testing. Now, incrementality testing is the only attribution per se, or the only way you can truly measure the impact of your advertising activity. And ultimately, you can never truly measure the lifetime value of your advertising activity because you literally have to actually follow every single customer throughout their entire life and see how many dollars they spend with you and how many people they refer to you and how many dollars those people spent with you. It's almost impossible to measure the true web of what happens if one person buys from you and what is the ultimate 100-year outcome of all those kind of trickle down effects. That's why it's ultimately kind of a fool's errand. With that though, incrementality is the closest you can get by far, and it negates in-platform attribution, it negates marketing models, it negates pretty much everything. It's the trump card of measurement. The way it works and how most incremental tests run, there's many different types, but the gist is, for example, you would show your ads to half of the country. The other half of the country you would not show your ads to. And then you would measure the delta or the difference in sales from zip codes in those two halves of the country. So you could just put in your geo-targeting on the ads manager platform, half and half, and then measure the sales with kind of a pre and post observational period to account for some drifters and to kind of isolate the variables. And then you could ultimately see, like, if we show half the country ads and the other half we don't show ads, are we going to ultimately see that those ads did have an impact in that half we did show ads to? And was the other half not very incremental, or was the other half still buying a lot even when we weren't showing them ads? And again, there's a lot of stuff that goes into this where you can't, oversaturate half the country a month before, so you don't get that lag effect. A lot of different things into this, but ultimately you're just seeing what happens if we show ads and don't show ads to two different areas, and then we measure the sales from those areas after, with a lot of statistical segregation to make sure it works. That's the only way to do it. And this ultimately will grant you kind of that incremental ROAS, or an incremental factor, which is a multiplier you can add to your in-platform metrics to translate over into real dollars. So if your in-platform is giving you a 2 ROAS and you have an incrementality of 1.2, that means for every dollar spent on, or every increment of ROAS on the platform, you're actually getting 20% more in real dollars. So that helps you translate from attributed dollars into actual dollars. So if you're at a 1 ROAS and you need a 1.2, you would be at a 1.2 ROAS incrementality factor. You have an extra 20% in actual dollars that the platform is responsible for. And then you can add that on to your daily forecasting and your daily analysis to translate, again, attributed dollars into actuals. So this is super important for 2025 and moving forward. Any brand at low 8 figures and really mid 8 figures at the highest should consider getting into incrementality testing. There's going to be some solutions coming out soon that are a lot less expensive for smaller brands, but right now the threshold to even get into it is fairly expensive, and it's only really useful if you are operating at one of those higher levels. Now looking at some of the technical pieces here. So on the events manager side for 2025, standard events, Shopify integration, doing all the APKI stuff, just do all you can in platform, okay? And if you have a 7+ match quality, you're pretty much good on the purchase add to cart level. If you have that 7+, you're in a good place. You really don't need to worry too much about custom server-side tracking or anything fancy like that. Though you can definitely add server-side tracking, and we typically do recommend it, especially for brands around that 7-figure level and up. Again, it just gets you a little bit more data, can help increase your event match quality a little bit more. That said, if you do have a low event match quality, if purchases and add to carts are at like a 5, you got to get that fixed. And if you can't get it fixed, try to get some server-side tracking in there to increase that up to at least a 7. Some tools for server-side tracking that are great and not very expensive relatively are Elevar and Upstackified. These also can help you create custom events like new customer purchases, so you can actually optimize for very custom events, focus on different segments of your market. That can be really useful for brands with very specific objectives, like new customer growth, but Meta is not technically super optimized for very custom objectives like that. So for most brands, just doing, again, standard event setup with server side is great. But if you want to take it to the next level, you can add in some of those custom events in there. But again, that would be more for mid 7-figure to 8-figure if you really want to get that niche into the event setup. All right, naming conventions. So I alluded to this twice already with the segregation between new and returning customers. But very important for this year is number one, getting a creative analytics tool in. If you're spending $50K or more a month in ads, even around a $30K a month mark, a creative analytics tool gets very helpful. Tools like Motion, Atria. I'm sure there's a million other options out there. You can spin one up with AI in probably a weekend. But these creative analytic tools really help you figure out which creatives are performing. They help you instantly visualize and see which creatives are performing based on a bunch of factors that you can set. So a big thing here is making sure that when you are naming your ads or your assets or your campaigns, that you're doing so intentionally and you're using that space to actually run tests. So if you want to run different angles in your ad sets, you should be giving ad sets names with those different angles so you can later measure performance by angle. Or on the creative side, if you have creatives with a black background and a red background, you want to add that into your creative title to actually break down that performance after by looking at those two different title names and seeing the performance separated. So some things we use this for jewelry brands, we have categories like on body and off body. We have necklaces, earrings, rings, etc. And so we can look at performance on Meta by necklaces, rings, etc. product category. We can look by on body, off body, on flat, in studio, lifestyle, and we just put all these little names within those actual campaign, ad set, and add titles so that we can use our Motion or Atria tool later to break that down into our different visualizations and reporting metrics, which helps keep the creative team informed and helps keep the media buyers aligned with everyone else on the team. So very, very important to have that for tracking and running tests that you care about, whether it's a background color or a style of creative or a particular element that is of importance, okay? The other big thing here is unique IDs for all creatives. So this, again, is not as important for those 6-figure brands out there, but 7 and up, you start to deal with a lot of creatives as you're increasing budgets and you can afford to have more tests running and you actually need more creatives to support a growing budget. It gets very messy in Google Drive or in Air or in Dropbox when you have all these creatives. So every single creative we upload has a unique ID. Every single placement of that creative also has a unique ID. And I'll share that tool with you today to generate these unique IDs, but it's very, very essential. For example, if you have a creative with an issue on it and you just uploaded a batch of 60 new creatives, it might be kind of hard to go and find wherever that creative exists in Drive. So all you have to do is copy that unique ID, paste it in Google Drive search, and you'll instantly have that creative that you used to source it with. So very important to have those unique IDs. absolutely essential for 2025 as well. All right, getting into some more of these free tools here. I want to touch on one more thing first, which I didn't actually go over, though it was mentioned a little bit earlier here. So we didn't talk much about cost controls. It's kind of saving the best for last here. So there's always a lot of debate around cost controls. In 2025, what is the best method? And the truth is they're both tools that have different functions, and you need to decide on the priority for you based on your current business. Okay, let me lay this out for you. There's lowest cost, and then there are cost controls, right? Lowest cost creates predictable volume with more volatile efficiency, meaning the ROAS can be a little bit all over the place, but typically the volume or the number of purchases you're getting every day is somewhat consistent. Cost controls ultimately result in a consistent efficiency or ROAS, but often result in more volatility on the amount of volume. So you could be at a 2 for a week straight or a 3 at a week straight, whatever you set on the ROAS side, but you might have a vastly different number of purchases depending on the day. It could be all over the place. And it just depends. Do you want predictable volume or predictable efficiency? That's the first question. The second one is, do you really have a tight budget and it's extremely dangerous for you to risk ad spend? If that's the case, probably going with a cost control would be a wise decision. Again, cost controls are just a lot more restrictive with spend, so they're not going to be really spending on an ad unless there's a high level of confidence that it's going to perform. So if you set that target ROAS goal, for example, at a 3, and you say, I want a 3, spend on whatever you have to spend to get me a 3, but if you can't get me a 3, don't spend. If that's the case and you have a small budget, small brand, that's an okay way to do that. But just realize sometimes it might take a lot longer for you to find a performing ad because you're going to have less data because you're spending less. So you'll have less to analyze and actually make iterative adjustments on. So it might slow you down in the long run, though you could save dollars today. The opposite is true of lowest cost. You're probably going to have more wasted spend on ads that don't perform, but you're going to have more metrics and soft data that you can use to inform your future iterations. So ultimately, it could make you move faster if those wasted dollars are not catastrophic for you. So that's the thing to consider. Now, typically, we test both for brands, and it does depend on the brand. Sometimes one or the other can work. Ultimately, with cost controls, you need an extremely high flow of creative to get them to perform. You always need fresh creative in there. Lowest cost, you do as well, but it can typically hang on to older assets a little bit longer in practice. So that's the consideration. Now, scaling with caps can be pretty advantageous for growing brands because, for example, if it's Black Friday or a holiday moment, you just want to spend as much as you possibly can at whatever efficiency target. And that can be a pretty good way to go for those big moments where you're like, I don't care what we spend a day. If we get a 3, spend as much as you want. We have unlimited inventory. That can be advantageous for some brands and a very good tool for certain periods of the year. But other brands have trouble getting cost caps to spend or cost controls to spend, even with an efficacious budget, even with a lot of creative. And in those cases, they ultimately scale off lowest cost. And in that case, it may make sense for them to use cost controls more selectively. We've grown brands to 8 figures off lowest cost and later added cost controls. We've done the opposite. Both can work. The most important thing is that every creative has an efficacious amount of potential spend, no matter your bid strategy. That's the most important thing at the end of the day. Bid strategy is just a tool. Typically, I recommend that brands do test on lowest cost and ultimately scale on cost controls, again, for that maintenance of the efficiency as you grow budget. But again, if you have a very tight budget, cost controls for testing are totally fine. And when it comes to which one to use, typically for a lot of brands, unless you're very advanced, would avoid bid caps for the majority of people. But ROAS goals and CPA goals are very simple to use. One is a ratio, one is a set net limit. So CPA goal, you tell it to get me a purchase for $10. Obviously, if you have a product that is $100 or if you have a product that's $1, that's going to cause a lot of different issues there. So you want to make sure that that CPA goal is only applied to ads, product journeys, and campaigns that are really focused on one particular product. So it all kind of lines up. If people go to your website and they often shop to a ton of different products and they don't really buy the product of the ad that they clicked on, a ROAS goal is probably going to be a little bit better because it's a ratio, and so it can kind of be mass applied across different values. In that case, you'll just set, for example, a 3 ROAS goal, and Meta will try to achieve that on whatever product people end up buying. So again, some flexibility there based on the customer journey and based on the priority of your business. But for most brands, try both, see what works for you. But typically, in general, test on lowest, scale on cost controls, unless you are very, very restricted on budget. Okay. Now, let me share these tools with you really quickly here. First, we have the unique creative ID generator. Now, all this does is it takes inputs from the drop-down menu. We have a custom app script here. You can save the creative ID, or you can bulk save it, and then it'll add it to your archive, and then you can just take these creative IDs and copy and paste them onto the file names of your assets. Very customizable to whatever variables you want, but right here we have, this is set up for agency, so we have different client names for the first 2 letters, the count, so it actively counts which creative number we're on. I believe this has support for maybe 10,000 ads. Then we select the format, which will also affect the ultimate name of the creative, and then whether it's raw or edited. And then we also pull in a date at the very end here. So there's a lot of information within the ID itself. We get the format, the version, whether it's an edited or raw asset, the date, and what creative number it is, and the client for us. For you, you could just change this drop down to whatever bit of data may be relevant for you, or just get rid of it completely. But this helps us log creative IDs and give every single creative a unique number so we can find it when we're dealing with thousands and thousands of ads. Okay, so that link will be below. The next one is the naming convention generator. This, again, is very important for testing those different variables that might be important for your brand. This is kind of our templated version here. So on the campaign level, we're going to name whether it's AFC, top of funnel, bottom of funnel, reactivation, whether it's a conversion, catalog, whatever it is. The budget type, again, we're always pretty much ABO. The bid strategy, lowest cost, cost control, bid cap, ROAS goal. This is actually, this is supposed to be actually CPA goal, but feel free to change it. Product category, this is great, again, because, again, we want to have single SKU campaigns. So we can have like a mattress campaign with our single mattress SKU, and there we go. And then new or returning, again, almost always new for us. So very straightforward there. And then ad set, we have some other information. And then at ad level, we have our ID, whether it's an image, video, whatever, the offer, the creative type, graphic, high production, UGC, and the destination even. And for videos, a great one to add in is the hook. So you can pull into Motion or Atria your hook test and see, hey, how did our different hooks work, or how did the different bodies or call to actions work in our content? And you can, again, pull that all into your creative tool. So lots of flexibility. All this can be adjusted in the tables here. You can name the variable you want to test, the identifier, and it will just actively update these drop downs. And these are just easy to copy and paste. You got to have good naming conventions in 2025. No more copy 1, copy 2 creative names. All right, moving on to the metric dashboard. This is a big one. There's a whole video on this tool. This is the older gen. We do have a newer gen coming out soon. Ultimately, what this does is it gives you a daily forecast for ad level revenue, ad level ROAS, etc., and ultimately levels up to a blended attributed revenue daily target. So for this particular tab, we can see like February is the projection month. We can make this whatever we want, and it will automatically adjust for seasonality, day of week, etc. This tells us what would happen to our ROAS if we spent X number of dollars for that given month. And then it distills it into a daily forecast, taking into account day of week, weekends, all that good stuff, and helps us figure out what our expectation on Google Ads, for example, in February should look like given these different spend levels. Then this also has Meta in here as well. And then, of course, we have a blended view, which blends in both channels and gives us that daily forecast. Dashboard, which pulls in a bunch of different metrics that you can look at over really any period of time. Also has a cost calculator to help you look at hypothetical revenues given different spends. And then it has instructions on how to input all your daily data from a year of historicals, as well as all of your variable costs. here to actually get that forecast. So really, really can help you ultimately figure out what you need here. All right. And then the last one here is the ad creative planning document. This is a really simple spreadsheet, but really effective. A lot of people will link these into Trello or other kind of task distribution or task management tools. Really straightforward. We have our creative team, copywriter, and media buyer use this tool. The copywriter goes in and kind of builds out their ad angle. They pick the emotion they want to build their ad angle with. Again, there's a whole tutorial on the document and thesis behind this ad building process. Ultimately pick the concept, the marketing moment, the overlay, the offer, the medium of the ad creative, the link, the ID, et cetera, ultimately gets reviewed. The marketing manager goes in and marks it as approved. And then the media buyer, after it's live, will kind of update it incrementally with how this particular creative is doing. So again, we can kind of evaluate how different angles, concepts, moments perform over time. And again, all of our angles are kind of based typically off of one of the buying emotions, which we have listed here. Again, another tutorial on that resource below. And as I mentioned before, Elevar and Upstacked are great for your first-party data. You can do it custom with Google Tags. It doesn't take too long. It's like an hour or two to set it up with Google Tag Manager to have your first-party kind of server-side tracking. That setup is pretty good, but this stuff is definitely more robust. So if you can afford it, I would look at either of these solutions. If it's too expensive, hit YouTube. There's a lot of tutorials on server-side tracking setup with Google Tag Manager for meta ads that they all kind of work the same. Okay. So that is the summary here today on all of this good stuff. Overall, this update is really going to affect mostly ASC and again, those advantage creative assets. So keep in mind that highly niche and highly personalized creative distribution that they've implemented and plan accordingly. But if you have any questions on any of these things today, let me know. A lot of this was high level conceptual content along with a few metric suggestions and principles. So again, if you need more information and you're like, I want something more tactile, I want a stronger plan to follow, feel free to just shoot me a message and I'll help you out, of course. Otherwise, again, all these links will be below. Okay. Have a great rest of your day. Catch you on the next one.